Welcome back to the book club. Today's video is a book review on Theft of Swords. This is volume 1 of the Riyria Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. And this is going to be a spoiler-free book review where I talk about my rating of the plot, the people, and the pacing of this book, and whether or not I'm going to continue reading this series. This is a 3-part series, and something sort of interesting about this book is this is the first volume of the book, which is actually the first 2 books in the series as they were written. So really, this is sort of just 2 books in one, and each of the 3 volumes in the series are actually both, they're sort of 2-book pairs. As I understand it, the author originally wrote these books and sort of like published them individually, and then at some point they published them independently. They got picked up by Orbit, and then Orbit republished them under these 3 volumes. So I'm going to be reviewing both books, and I'm going to give them separate ratings just because I think they have different strengths and weaknesses. So I think it's only fair to really judge them both individually, because honestly, reading the second book kind of made the first book a little bit better in some ways that I'll get to in a second. So I guess to kick us off before I dive into the plot, this is really a high fantasy, kind of classical fantasy world with humans and elves and dwarves, although mostly focused on the humans for the most part here, with a little bit of magic, but the magic is kind of mysterious. It's if you're looking for something with a lot of magic or deep magical systems, this book definitely isn't it. But if you're looking for adventure, it's kind of a band of a thief and a warrior, sort of going off on missions together. That is the structure of the book, at least these first 2 books in the volume. I'm not sure if the rest of it continues this, but there's basically, each book has its own little plot, mystery that they're unraveling, but also there seems to be this overarching plot that I imagine is going to continue throughout the entire series. So, speaking of plot, my rating for this book is a 7 for book 1 and an 8 for book 2. So let me see if I can pull up the names of the individual books real quick. But so book 1 is called The Crown Conspiracy and book 2 is called Avempartha. So on Goodreads, they're kind of listed separately, but also together as this volume, Theft of Swords. So The Crown Conspiracy, I'm rating a 7 out of 8, and Avempartha for the plot, I'm rating a 7 out of 10, and Avempartha, I'm rating an 8 out of 10. So the reason why I think book 1 was a little bit weaker was it doesn't quite dive into the like overarching plot stuff. Yeah, it's really like a dip your toes in. It's kind of just a little mystery story where you learn a little bit more about the world. You learn about, a wizard, and you learn more about the 2 main characters and some of the side characters that seem to come up in later books, or at least in book 2, they make an appearance as well. So it's really like an establishing book, but the plot is kind of generic and basic, and was very easily predictable. It was kind of set up as this like whodunit situation where I think most people will probably figure out whodunit. For the most part, there's a little bit of a twist that's like, I think, a surprise, like an unpredictable surprise, but for the most part, it was very predictable. However, book 2, I think, was a big improvement on that. It was another sort of, they have a mission that they're set off on and they need to go do that mission, but it really dug more into the lore of the world. So there's a lot more world building in the second book's plot, and it really started to kick off okay, well, what's happening like in this overarching plot that's going to last the entire series? What's happening there? And so I really liked adding more of that into the second book's plot. And I think it really improved upon a lot of the sort of setup stuff in the first book. Next up, my rating of the people. So again, book 1, my rating is going to be a 6 out of 10, but book 2, I would rate an 8 out of 10. Book 1, it does have the downside of having to like establish the characters, which inherently makes things a little bit more confusing because you're not sure which names you need to remember because they're actually important characters and which ones are just side characters. And so one of the problems I had with book 1 was just there were so many, this is classical fantasy. There's a lot of knights and like lords and blah, 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 in a bunch of different regions. There's a map in the beginning of the book, which I kept referring to. I don't think it's necessary to, but just to figure out where these different like kingdoms were that they were talking about. And it added a lot of complexity where complexity in a non-satisfying way. So it was just like complex to understand who they're talking about, There's like a point where they do a mission for a guy early on in the book, and his name blended in with everybody else's. And later in the book, he comes up again, and I kind of forgot who he was until eventually, through context clues, I figured out, oh wait, that's the same guy from the beginning, which usually doesn't happen to me in books. I've also been reading the Malazan series, and there's a billion names, and I don't really have that much trouble keeping track of who's who. But in this book, there was just so many lords and minor nobility. It was hard to wrap my head around, who was who, and they're all very thin except for the main characters. Also, just in book one, we don't learn that much about. So Royce and Hadrian are the two main characters. We don't learn that much about them, which is why I sort of take some additional points off of my like character people rating here. There's not that much depth that gets added. The conversations are pretty basic. And also just one overall detractor. This is throughout books 1 and 2. It plays a part in both. The dialogue's kind of all over the place. Some interactions are very reasonable. They're, normal fantasy dialogue, whatever. But there are some some conversations that happen where it's just like two people shouting at each other and refusing to listen. And then it kind of ends on like a very sitcom-y, like, oh, well, if only I was able to tell her all of what I had to say, then they wouldn't be so confused, which I think is just really annoying because it's just not realistic. Two people don't really just shout at each other saying misaligning things without being like, hold on, just listen to me. Let me dump something at you, and then you're going to be fine. So that also sort of took away from the characters for me. I sort of rate the dialogue in this people bucket. Onto book 2, Avempartha. I'd rate the people 8 out of 10. Again, this has the benefit of I already know who the main characters are. I know which characters are important. So there are plenty of other random characters that are added, of course, that aren't important, or die quickly or whatever. But it wasn't as much of a problem as in book 1. There's not as much like telling you about random lords and ladies across the realm and the various kingdoms and which land they're battling for and blah blah blah, which was like mostly not related to the plot. I'm thinking of like Perpendicular or something. I don't know. It's not really related to the plot, so it just wasn't important for me to know about the kingdoms in that way. But in book 2, again, this improves a lot. It's a lot more concise. The characters that matter are actually spoken about a lot. The characters that don't matter are not spoken about that much. There's not conversations about a bunch of characters that don't ever come up again. And in the back of this book, there's actually like a big list of terms and names, and it's this massive list of characters, and most of them just like don't matter at all. Maybe they will later, and I'll be kind of wrong about this opinion, but there's just so many that don't matter at all, and most of them came up in book 1. So that's sort of why my book 1 rating is a lot lower here. And maybe on a reread of book 1 after I read the entire series, it won't be a big problem. But at least for a first read, I think that's the fair way to sort of rate books. And now the last category here is pacing. My rating for this is just combined for the books because I think it's both the same, but I rate the pacing a 10 out of 10. I think, despite its flaws in book 1, the pacing was still really good. Both books. So, I have the physical copy here. It's about 650 pages total. Book 1 is like 300 of those pages, and book 2 is 350. So it's like 2 300-ish page fantasy books. And the pacing is actually pretty tight throughout. There's sort of constant things happening. There's not a lot of, useless walking between point A and B and just like talking about nothing. There's not like these large gaps where you just don't learn a lot of information, and there's just a lot of character building that's maybe boring to some people. So I think the pacing was incredible for both books. It's sort of, Michael Sullivan here does sort of the multi-character thing where he'll tell a little bit of story A and then a little bit of story B, and then sometimes they'll converge or whatever. And I think that helps the pacing. As characters are starting to move towards a destination, we cut over to see what the other characters are doing, and when we cut back, they are just at the destination that they were going for, and the plot just moves along, or like however many days pass as necessary. We don't have to worry about what they're doing every single day on a 10-day journey. So I think the pacing was awesome. And going on to the last point, will I continue to read this series? The answer is definitely yes. I have heard a lot of good things about the series. I saw some ratings on Goodreads too after I finished that said, people were rating it more highly after having finished the series. from what I understand, again, this entire like 6-book thing was written before it ever got published. I believe before any of the books individually even got published. So apparently, there's a lot of good foreshadowing towards what actually happens in the end. So I'm sure that I missed some of it. I think there's some things that I've picked up on about what's going on with the overarching plot, but I probably missed some of the things that are going to be revealed later, and that's what excites me about these types of books. Even though I rated the characters a 6 out of 10 in book one, I still thought it was a fun read. It was like it's a fun adventure story with two friends that make fun of each other and have a good time, and also get into some trouble. So it was a very fun reading, very very interesting read. It's not like incredibly deep so far, at least, but there's some mysteries to the world. There's like a lot of classical human versus elf versus dwarf racism stuff going on. I'm kind of curious to see how that stuff develops, because every fantasy author kind of takes those like race relationships differently. And I'm looking forward to reading more. So if you've read this series and you have thoughts about it, let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in reading the series, having read this review, let me know. I'd be interested to hear what you think once you do read it. That's all for this video. See you next time.